Subunit 1 for Unit 8. Unit 8 is about the Cold War and decolonization after 1900. And Subunit 1 is about setting the stage for the Cold War and decolonization. After the global conflict of World War II, the largely unfulfilled hopes for greater colonial self-government after World War I was revived. Shastri's anti-imperialist sentiments helped explain how global affairs changed after the war ended in 1945. Colonies' desire for independence became intertwined with a global ideological conflict between capitalist countries led by the United States and communist countries led by the Soviet Union. Great Britain, United States, and Soviet Union were known as the Big Three. The Potsdam Conference was the final meeting among leaders of the Big Three. The Potsdam Conference began in July 1945 in Germany. Harry Truman, who became president after Roosevelt died on April 12th, represented the United States. Churchill started the conference but lost his position as prime minister in mid-July and was replaced by Clement Attlee. Truman insisted on free elections in Eastern Europe. However, by then, Soviet troops had occupied the region. Stalin refused Truman's demand, which the backing of Soviet power, communists eventually gained control of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. There was a shift in balance of power. When the war ended in 1945, parts of Europe and Asia had been devastated. The war resulted in 40 million and 60 million deaths. It destroyed factories, roads, bridges, and other structures needed for industrial production. It forced millions of people to move. Many were fleeing communism or searching for safety and opportunity. Wartime losses were not evenly distributed throughout Europe. In general, East and Central Europe suffered greater losses than Western Europe. Worse hit were the Soviet Union, Poland, and Germany, which each lost 10 and 20% of its population. The start of the Cold War. The U.S.-Soviet tensions evident in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam made conflicts likely. However, the high cost of war meant that neither superpower wanted a full-scale war with each other. Rather, they settled into a Cold War, a conflict that does not involve direct military confrontation between two or more rival states. The Cold War between the superpowers played out in propaganda campaigns, secret operations, and an arms race. The deadliest results of the Cold War occurred outside the lands of the two superpowers. In the early 1950s, the United States and Soviet Union each developed a hydrogen bomb that was more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. President Dwight Eisenhower expressed his concerns about the U.S.-Soviet competition for supremacy in nuclear armaments. He warned against allowing the military-industrial complex, the informal alliance between the government and the large defense contractors, to gain too much power. In later decades, citizens in many countries expressed similar worries. They began to protest the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. breakdown of empires. After World War II, efforts resumed to undermine colonialism. The start of World War I had marked a high point of colonial empires. The British, the French, and other Europeans had colonized almost all of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, and they dominated China. Empires based in Austria, Turkey, and Russia were multi-ethnic states, and each were dominated by one group, leaving others feeling discriminated against. After World War I, the demand for self-determination, the idea that each country should choose its own form of government leaders, was spreading.
Unit 8, Subunit 2, the Cold War. The U.S., which was democratic, and the Soviet Union, which was authoritative, emerged as the strongest countries in the world after World War II. They both expanded their territorial control and influence after the war. After the Potsdam Conference in Germany of 1945, Truman and Stalin recognized the rivalry for dominance over Europe and Asia. This conflict, noted by the Baruch, which was the power struggle between capitalism and communism, was a global conflict for over the next 40 years, also known as the Cold War. The Allies shared a commitment to building a new organization, known that which was to replace the League of Nations, which failed for two reasons. It lacked support of powerful countries like the U.S. and a mechanism to stop small conflicts that escalated into larger ones. The UN was created by the U.S., Great Britain, and Soviet Union, and China. The existence of the United Nations did not prevent from growing worse between the tensions from growing worse between the Soviet Union and the West. The Iron Curtain was described as a split between the East and West Europe. One big difference between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was how they organized economies. In the U.S., they had factory economic assets, and things that were owned privately. However, for communist countries, assets were owned by the government and such. And the other difference was how they organized the political system. The U.S. had elected leaders through free elections, but the Soviets had elections which basically had no point and was operated by the government and single-handedly dominated all politics. They saw flawed each other's as the U.S. attacked the Soviet system for restricting rights, and the Soviets attacked the U.S. of giving poor people the freedom to starve, and how women's equality was a difference in the U.S. They both had big economic decisions. There was groups, and either the government or millions of shareholders. Both countries acted out of fear. The USSR had many satellite countries such as Hungary, Poland, Romania that were all used to develop 5-year plans and help countries grow. They were small states, economically or politically dependent on the larger state, also known as the Soviet Union. The World Revolution was an enhanced concept that and was a belief that organized workers that would overthrow capitalism in all countries, meaning the Soviets supported the revolutions and uprisings between 1919. Containment. The U.S. followed a policy of containment, which meant they would push against Soviet communism whenever it arose. And the Truman Doctrine, which was a strong statement that the United States would do whatever it had to stop the spread of communist influence, especially in Greece and Turkey, in which they aided them and sent them money and such. The Marshall Plan after World War I was used, in which it was enacted to offer 12 billion in aid to all nations of Europe, including Germany. This would be used to modernize, reduce trade barriers, and rebuild economically damaged countries. The space race was first started in 1957, in which the Soviet Union launched a first artificial satellite called Sputnik to orbit around the Earth. The U.S. then launched the first satellite in January 58. They competed for who would go to the moon for first, in which the U.S. won, as Neil Armstrong made one big step for man, one huge leap for humanity. MAD was the mutually assured destruction or doctrine, in which both countries had such large nuclear powers that a single missile could devastate both countries. This led to very high tensions, but low fighting, in which peace was capped through terror. The non-alignment movement was when many African Asian countries wanted to stay out of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, in which the Bandung Conference held by Indonesia sent representatives from 28 countries that prompted the non-alignment movement, where they supported for international institutions, and they had different opinions on their own interests as well.
Subunit 3: Effects of the Cold War. With the start of the Cold War, new military alliances for mutual protection formed in different parts of the world. The threat of nuclear war, as noted above, kept the United States and the Soviet Union from starting a war that could end in unprecedented global destruction. But proxy wars, such as ones in Korea and Vietnam, resulted in millions of deaths. In a proxy war, a major power helps bring about a conflict between other nations, but does not always fight directly. These conflicts underlined the political and philosophical divide between the superpowers. The superpowers faced off in Cuba and several other Central American countries, as well as in the African country of Angola. The combination of military, economic, and nuclear influence across the globe made the world a tense place for decades after World War II. The war the two superpowers had worked together to end. The Allies also decided to divide Germany's capital, Berlin, into 4 zones. The 3 western zones would become a free city that was located within the Soviet zone of Germany. The Soviets wanted to stop these western plans and control all of Berlin. They set up a blockade of the western zones in Berlin to prevent the West from moving supplies into the area by land. The Western Allies did not want to risk a military confrontation with the Soviets and ultimately began the Berlin airlift. In August 1961, they began replacing the fences in Berlin with a wall, which became known as the Berlin Wall. Between 1961 and 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, soldiers killed about 150 people as they tried to escape over it. Out of desire to coordinate their defenses in case of conflict with the Soviets, several Western nations created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, in April 1949. The Soviets Union response to NATO was the Warsaw Pact created in 1955. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union were the original members. Warsaw Pact nations combined their armed forces and based their enemy leaders in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. These nations were known as the Communist Bloc. The Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, was an anti-Soviet treaty organization formed by Great Britain, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey to prevent the spread of communism in the Middle East. The United States was not a full member, but it joined CENTO's military committee. An example of a proxy war was the Korean War. Just as the victorious powers divided Germany after World War II, they also divided the Korean peninsula. The Soviets occupied the north while the United States and its allies occupied the south. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, began when North Korea invaded South Korea in an attempt to reunite the country under its leadership. Another example was the Vietnam War. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, following the Truman policy of containment, sent military advisors to South Vietnam to try to keep communism out of Vietnam. Fidel Castro and other communist revolutionaries overthrew the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets began to support Cuba with arms and military advisors. Nikita Khrushchev, who came to power after Stalin, saw an opportunity in Cuba. In 1962, he shipped nuclear missiles to Cuba. Khrushchev felt justified in his actions because in the summer of 1961, the United States had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, a U.S. ally that shared a border with the Soviet Union. The nuclear arms race spawned a reaction known as the anti-nuclear weapons movement. One of the first such movements developed in Japan in 1954 in opposition to the U.S. testing a nuclear weapon in the Pacific Ocean. People worldwide worried about deaths and environmental harm that the nuclear war or nuclear testing. In 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and more than 100 other states signed a nuclear test ban treaty.
Unit 8, Subunit 4, Spread of Communism after 1900. The Cold War provided a lot of context in which people and countries wrestled their past, figuratively, of course. Land reform was a vital issue in China, Iran, Vietnam, Ethiopia, India, and Latin American countries such as Mexico, Bolivia, Venezuela. After the Japanese were defeated in 1945, the Chinese Civil War resumed because, they teamed up to unite against Japan, who conquered Manchuria previously. Mao Zedong supported land distribution to peasants, opened schools, and punished soldiers who mistreated civilians, making him very popular, actually. And the Great Leap Forward, which was a land reform part, which was part of a policy that organized land into communes, and people who protested this policy were sent to re-education camps or killed. The Cultural Revolution of 1966 saw Mao attempting to put back commitment into China and communism that silenced critics of Mao and solidified his hand in power. Red Guards were groups of revolutionary students that seized officials, teachers, and others and sent them to the countryside for re-education. China and Soviet Union were both communist states. They were actually hostile to each other. They had a few skirmishes. In Iran, the leader considered supporting Hitler's Nazi regime, but did not let that happen. He was actually forced to abdicate power to the Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. They kept their forces until the end of the war. In 1951, they forced him to flee the country, and later selected Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. Despite his harsh rule, he saw several progressive reforms, such as the White Revolution, that came without bloodshed and saw the recognizing of women's right to vote, social welfare, and the funding of literary programs. Many landowners who had not been forced to sell their lands and frustrate presents received nothing opposed land farms. And in 1979, the Iranian Revolution toppled Shah, like boom, boom, bat. The new government was a theocracy that was formed in which religion was the supreme authority. In Latin America, such as Venezuela, the government freed themselves from colonialism and went back to land ownership. In Venezuela, 5 million acres were redistributed to peasants and landowners. In Guatemala, the elected democracy government picked Jacob Arbenz. In Vietnam, Japan occupied Vietnam during the World War II, but at the end, Vietnam declared independence from French and Japanese control. It was an agricultural society which few people controlled most of the lands. The communists wanted to seize the lands from large landowners and give it back to the peasants. But in South Vietnam, the government was slow to implement the land reform, and so it was one reason it remained unpopular. In Ethiopia, Italy shortly occupied it, but it remained an independent country. In India, which has been under British rule since 1858, Mahatma Gandhi led a independence movement, but in 1947, it was separated into two countries, which we mentioned earlier. Some reforms in both countries were shown. The state passed a land reform. Tenants won the right to purchase. New laws allowed tenants to be full owners, and laws provided for fixed hours of work and minimum wage.
Subunit 5, Decolonization after 1900s. In the 20th century, otherwise known as 1900s, nationalist groups and leaders challenged colonial rule not only through land reform, but also through political negotiation. As in India, and armed struggle, as in Angola, struggles for independence after World War I, and the failure of many independence movements added to anti-colonial sentiments. during World War II. Empires became politically unacceptable. European powers struggled to hold on to their colonies. Notions of freedom born of World War II rhetoric helped speed up decolonization. The process coincided with the World War and the development of the United Nations. Nguyen Sao Sai, a South Vietnamese military and political leader, noted above that this country's war was part of a Cold War. The Muslim League was founded in 1906, and it advocated a separate nation for Indian Muslims, and the nation that they got was Pakistan. But the person that helped them get free from Britain, Gandhi, was very against a different India. But the Muslims were scared that they would have little voice in this connected India because of how there was many more Hindus in India, so they would be controlling of them. In Ghana, they got their independence in 1957, and their first president, Kwame Nkrumah, took office in 1960. Nkrumah constructed a national narrative that centered on having a historical past of glory and rich tradition, founding fathers, a currency, a flag, an anthem, museums, and monuments. He was responsible for numerous public works and development projects such as hydroelectric plants. But critics accused him of running the country into debt and allowing widespread corruption. In Algeria, the French colony of Algeria endured lots of violence and more violence than Ghana had endured. The Algerian War for Independence began in 1954, and there was guerrilla techniques used, which meant they used their environment to their advantage. Both Ghana and Algeria experienced growing pains under military rule, but the main struggles were between those who favored multi-party states and those who favored single-party socialism. Struggles and compromise in Egypt. Gamal Abdel Nasser. Following World War II, Egypt became one of 6 founding members of the Arab League, which grew to 22 member states. In 1952, General Gamal Abdel Nasser, along with Mohammed Naguib, overthrew the king and established the Republic of Egypt. Naguib became its first president, Nasser its second. Nasser was a great proponent of Pan-Arabism, which was a movement promoting the cultural and political unity of Arab nations. Similar transnational movements would attempt to unite all Africans, Pan-Africanism. and its working people communism. The Suez Crisis, built by Egyptian laborers, thousands of whom who died while working on the project. With money from the French investment between 1959 and 1969, the Suez Canal had been under lease to the French for 99 years. To the Egyptians, this lease symbolized colonial exploitation, which Nasser pledged to fight. Use the United Nations to broker a resolution to the Suez Crisis. The U.S. had efforts to a peaceful compromise. The incident also was an example of a nation maintaining a non-aligned position between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers in the Cold War.
Unit 8, Subunit 6, newly independent states. Former colonies handed over was handed over government control by these new states. These boundaries or borders led to conflicts, population displacement, and resettlement. In India, Sri Aurobindo partitioned Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan, but Pakistan was actually divided again because it was so far away, like two separate places. They created Bangladesh. But Israel, it founded its relationship with its neighbors. So basically, the Zionist movement in the 1890s was based on Theodore Herz, who was a journalist. They used evidence that the assimilation of Jews was failing to provide safety and equal opportunity. Zionist hopes that a new state could be established in Palestine because that's where they claim their ancestors lived like 1,400 years ago. But in modern times, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, which practiced Islam. But Zionists argued Jews could be free from persecution in Palestine. So the British did the Balfour Declaration, which established Palestine and established a national home for Jewish people in Palestine. But it was a lot more complicated than the British believed. Lawrence of Arabia promised certain Arabs independence day as well, that in the hope that the British office, the Arabs would arise against the Ottoman Empire. After World War I, Britain was giving a mandate over the Ottoman islands, or over the Ottoman lands, and Arabs protested against the loss of land and their traditional way of life. Jews had a lot of sympathy after the Holocaust, and British really wanted to give the land to Britain. The UN divided Palestine Jewish and Arab sections, and the Jewish section declared itself to be Israel. Multiple wars broke out in the Middle East, such as the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. After 30 years of conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Jimmy Carter was a diplomat and negotiated the Camp David Accords, which was a peace agreement between Prime Minister Menachem of Israel and Prime Minister Anwar Sadat of Egypt. The PLO under Arafat wanted to return the occupied lands to Palestine. And there's a lot of ongoing violence, you know what I mean? The Fatah faction, the Hamas faction, was split when, split into two factions. Hamas controlled Gaza security concerns, on the West Bank as well, and accounting to economic sanctions severely restricted normal activity. Israel further angered Palestine by proving settlements on lands that occupied in previous wars. Between 2000 and 2014, 7,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were killed in the conflict. Going back to Cambodia, after World War II, Cambodia's ruling family continued to head the government. But following the Vietnam War, a communist guerrilla organization called the Khmer Rouge, under Big Pol Pot, overthrew the right-wing government and followed the Chinese model of the Cultural Revolution, targeted individuals and dissenters. The famine took 2 million lives. Mass graves of victims were called killing fields of Cambodia, and they continue to be discovered to this day. In 1977, Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia to support opponents of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. The Vietnamese took control of the Cambodia and helped the country gain some stability, actually. In India and Pakistan becoming separate countries, the partition was very chaotic. 10 people moved. It led to mass migration and the Kashmir conflict, which is a point of tension to this day. Kashmir, which borders the mountainous region, Kashmir were actually originally Muslims, but its leader was a Hindu who pledged allegiance to India. This caused a war to break out, and both developed significant nuclear weapons. Pakistan controlled about 35%, India 45%, and China 20%. Women gaining power in South Asia. Sri Lanka became in Sri Lanka, the world's first female prime minister was Sirimavo Bandarkh. In India, 2 years after India's first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, his only child Indira Gandhi, became India's leader. She was underestimated first, but proved to be an effective advisor, distancing herself in some ways from her old father, and made political moves that strengthened India. Pakistan elected Benazir Bhutto prime minister in 1988. Her father served as prime minister, and she was elected the first female leader of a majority Muslim country. She improved the economy and then went into exile from 1999. She returned to Pakistan and she was killed. That's not good. Tanzania modernizes. The Tanzania gained its independence from Britain in 1961, later becoming the United Republic of Tanzania. Julius Nyerere was a instituted African socialist political and economic ideas.
Subunit 7 Global Resistance to Established Power Structures. The conflicts of the 20th century affected newly independent states and long-established ones. Some of the most successful challenges to existing order, such as the one led by Mohandas Gandhi, and used nonviolence. Other movements, such as the Shining Path in Peru, used violence against civilians to achieve political results. Some leaders, such as Francisco Franco in Spain, used military to crush resistance. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned about took hold in other countries as governments increased arms supplies and traded weapons with one another. Some examples of nonviolence leaders that led to change was Mohandas Gandhi in 1947, Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 60s, and they were great people. And Nelson Mandela in South Africa tried to fix the racial segregation of apartheid. Challenges to Soviet power in Eastern Europe. Poland, in 1946, Polish workers demonstrated against Soviet domination and demanded better living conditions. Hungary, in the same year, Hungarian protesters convinced the country's political leader Imre Nagy to declare Hungary's freedom from Soviet control. Czechoslovakia. The reform movement in Czechoslovakia reached a peak in the Prague Spring of 1968. Alexander Dubček, first secretary of the Communist Party, acceded to the demands of the Czech people. (1968), the year of revolt. Events in Czechoslovakia were just one of many upheavals in 1968. In Yugoslavia, students marched against authoritarian government. Poland and Northern Ireland, people protested over religious issues. Japan, students protested both university financial policies and government support for the United States in the war in Vietnam. An age of terrorism. Several small groups in Islam used a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, one widely condemned by mainstream Muslims to justify terrorism. Among these groups were the Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, the Islamic State of Iraq in the Middle East, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. Most victims were Muslims. Some high-profile attacks occurred in European cities such as Madrid, London, and Paris. Terrorism in the United States. While the September 11th attack was the deadliest act of terrorism in the United States, it was not the only one. Acts of terrorism in the United States come from different sources and groups, including domestic groups, some of which associated with the white nationalists or extreme right-wing views. Response of militarized states. The Franco dictatorship in Spain from 1939 to 1975 had come to power by overthrowing a popularly elected government that included many leftists. Franco's anti-communism made him an ally of the United States, but he was not a good person. Thank you for watching.